General quarters. All hands man your battle stations.
Welcome to WETSU, a Battleship New Jersey podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Spevak, CEO and Executive Director of the Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today's episode is proudly brought to you by ELEC 825, the labor employer cooperative of Operating Engineers Local 825, whose highly skilled members were instrumental in the recent dry docking of America's most decorated battleship. I'm honored to be joined today by a distinguished historian, accomplished author, and proud USS New Jersey veteran, Paul Stillwell. Paul's naval career spanned 3 decades of active and reserve service. He first joined the U.S. Navy Reserve in 1962 as an enlisted sailor, earning the rating of personnel man, 3rd class, before commissioning as an ensign in 1966. He served on active duty through 1969, including deployments aboard the tank landing ship Washoe County, LST 1165, in the Western Pacific and Vietnam. From May to October 1969, Paul served as Assistant Combat Information Center Officer aboard the USS New Jersey, BB-62. In early 1988, the Navy once again called on Paul's expertise, recalling him to active duty to document the U.S. Navy's operations in the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War, a testament to his skill as a historian and his deep understanding of naval service. He was awarded 2 Navy Commendation Medals for his distinguished contributions in both theaters. Beyond his service, Paul dedicated 30 years to the U.S. Naval Institute in Annapolis, Maryland, where he helped shape the preservation and telling of naval history for generations. He is the author and editor of 14 books, including The Battleship New Jersey, The Complete History, which will be released, the new edition, on August 5th, 2025. His other acclaimed works include Battleship Commander, The Life of Vice Admiral Willis Lee, also a battleship veteran. Widely cited and deeply respected, Paul Stillwell remains one of the foremost authorities on this great naval warship and its remarkable legacy. Paul, welcome to WETSU. We're honored to have you on board.
Thank you, Marshall. And that was just wonderful to hear you recite all those things.
So let's start this conversation where I always start, which is, why did you join the Navy?
The Selective Service was drafting people back in that era. This is the early 1960s. And Vietnam, interestingly, was not even a cloud on the horizon at the time. So there was no idea just to avoid the draft to get out of that. But my father was a merchant marine officer, and he steered my brother and me to the Naval Reserve. And it was very convenient because the Reserve Center was only 2.5 blocks from our house in Springfield, Missouri. And so I drilled every Thursday night for 4 years while an undergraduate, and then was commissioned after attending OCS during the summer breaks after my sophomore and junior year. And I had a few bits of reserve sea duty in the spring of 1966, just before I was commissioned. Upon graduation from Drury College, I received orders to go to the LST Washoe County, which was home port in Yokosuka, Japan. So after some preliminary training at the amphibious base in Coronado, California, I caught some MAC flights, wound up in the home port of Yokosuka, Japan, and I must say that was not nearly as convenient as the Reserve Center being 2.5 blocks from home.
Sounds like it.
I would add one more thing. After I'd been over there for a while and several deployments to Vietnam, my dad forwarded a letter from the Selective Service, and it said, "We observe that your educational deferment has expired. You are therefore ordered to report to Fort Riley, Kansas for a pre-induction physical before joining the Army." So I wrote back to the Selective Service. I said, "I'm over here fighting this war, and I'm not coming to Fort Riley." Never heard from them again.
That's great. You mentioned you served on the Washoe County, a landing ship tank vessel. That ship, from what I understand, served all over the South and East China Seas over the years that you were on board. What was life like on the LST versus then comparatively to, I know a little bit of a different circumstance, but life aboard, the Battleship New Jersey?
All the difference in the world. The LST would displaced about 6,000 tons, which is maybe a tenth of the New Jersey. It had a flat bottom, so when you got to sea, you'd roll, you'd stump, pound down on the sea. Had an open tank deck in which we could haul rolling stock, flat main deck, so helicopters could come in. So for the first year and a half, 2 years, we were basically a cargo ship. And one time in Okinawa, we were carrying some semi-trailers, and they had to be griped down to cloverleaf patterns in the practice. And one young seaman, about 19 years old, was using a turnbuckle to tighten it so the trailer would not move around in a seaway. And unfortunately, the front wheels that folded up or down had not been secured in a locked position. And the more he turned the turnbuckle, the trailer collapsed on him. And so he died at the age of 19, and his name is not on the memorial in Washington, but he's as much a casualty of that war as many others are. In 1968, we joined up with the amphibious Ready Group off the coast of Vietnam, mainly operating north of Da Nang, had Marines on board, and so we'd send raiding parties ashore. Interestingly, my brother had been commissioned. He was serving in the LPH Princeton, and so we had a few visits back and forth. And for the sake of our stomachs, it's good that Bupers detailed us the way it did, because I did not get seasick on board the ship that would roll in a 90-degree arc, 45 degrees each way. My brother rode our ship for about 3 days one time, and most of the time had to spend in the sack because his stomach was not the same. So serving in what was essentially a helicopter carrier that didn't roll was a real advantage for him. I might add that later in that year of 68, we went down to the Delta area, the very southern tip of South Vietnam, and we were a mothership for swift boats and Coast Guard PBs. They would make river runs, and on several occasions, boats would get shot up by the Viet Cong ashore, and so we would have to call in medevac helicopters to take them away for treatment. In one case, I could see from the bridge, a gunner's mate had a gouge out of the area of his knee. Looked like maybe a giant shark bite. And there was a Lieutenant JG in the same boat, and he'd been shot in the ankle. And I later talked to those two men. Gunner's mate Ponder sent out a email to each member of the Washoe County who was on board that day. Been very resourceful in getting those addresses. And the thrust of his message was, "Thank you for saving my life that day." And he said the JG begged the surgeons ashore to try to save his foot, but could not. And interestingly, the Lieutenant JG later became an orthopedic surgeon. The captain of our ship encouraged the officers and enlisted crew to go along on these river runs so we would have an appreciation of what was involved with these men that we were supporting. So I went out one day, we went up a river, we got to a place where there was a trestle all the way across the river. It was an obvious ambush site because we had to stop, turn around, and then get out. But by good fortune, the Viet Cong took that day for a holiday, and so we didn't get shot at. But I have so much respect for the guts of those young men, officers and enlisted, who made those trips day after day. And in the process of serving in the Washoe County, I heard about the New Jersey being reactivated and recommissioned to serve in Vietnam. And that set my mind to thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to serve in such a beautiful, important ship as that? Well, sometimes you get really lucky in life, and I had a commanding officer who had a higher opinion of my capability than I thought I did. He wrote a glowing fitness report, positive recommendation on my application to join the New Jersey, and sometimes you get exactly what you want in life. I got a call with my detailer at the Bureau of Personnel, and he said, "It looks like I've got you a job on the wagon." And I was so excited, I could not get to sleep all night that night in my bunk on board the LST.
How long was it from that time to the actual transfer came through?
Well, the orders came very soon.
Okay.
I was to be transferred in April. I got that news in January. And in the meantime, the New Jersey came into port in Yokosuka, and I had read in the local paper, which I subscribed to from Missouri, that there was a lieutenant named Dick Harris from Springfield on board. So I sought him out. So I had a friend as soon as I stepped aboard, and he was very kind. And he had one of the 5-inch batteries along the side when there were still 25-inch guns on board New Jersey. So in April, the day finally came to detach, and so I got a hop to go back to the States. And I went to the Navy Exchange in Long Beach, which was the home port for the ship. And I wrote a check, and my checkbook had the return address, USS New Jersey. And the woman, the clerk in the exchange, said, "Your ship's not coming back." And it turned out that just at the time I detached from the Washoe County, the North Koreans had shot down an EC-121 intelligence plane.
Right.
And so the Defense
Turned right
Department
back around.
sent a whole bunch of ships there to try to menace North Korea. And the New Jersey's orders were just to go in the general vicinity and hide. But the result was that I then had 30 days leave and then reported on board in May 20th, 1969. And if you can talk about dreams coming true, that was for me.
We just talked to Ken Kirsch, who I know you know, also a Vietnam veteran of the ship, and he was supposed to transfer off this ship on its way back, and he woke up in the morning and his fellow sailor said, "Well, so we turned around and we're heading back after the airliner went down," and he ended up missing his sister's wedding because of that. So we just heard that great story from Ken just in 2 episodes ago.
Ken is a fine person.
Yes, he is. You served as the assistant CIC officer while on board here. Can you tell us a little bit about what that job did for the ship?
Well, just to compare again to the Washoe County, when I was operations officer on board that ship, in my division were 3 radarmen, 3 electronics technicians, and some quartermasters. So when I got to the New Jersey, instead of having 3 radarmen, as they were called then, there were about 50 in the division. So I was the OI division officer, 2 chief petty officers who ran the division well, and I did my part. We had a secret compartment, sort of more or less secret, and that's where the electronic warfare specialist was, the spooks, as they're sometimes called. So I went to a Navy school in California to learn more about that. Principally, my duty was to look after the men in the division, personal issues, encouragement. In this case, though, it was kind of hard to teach them a lot because they'd been on the deployment and I had not. So I was, again, learning on the job as I had with my first ship. Most of my duty involved sitting in one of the chairs in Combat Information Center, way down on the 4th deck. The watches came around, I think we were in 4 sections. And then for every special evolution, whether it was general quarters or special sea detail, I was in that chair. And so we'd get phone talkers say, "Oh, we just passed under the Golden Gate Bridge," or "We just did that." All I could get was just a vicarious impression because I couldn't get outside to see it. But one of the really favorable things was that an ensign named Craig Kennedy had just graduated from the University of Washington, just been commissioned, and he sat in the other chair at the console as we looked at the radar scope and looked around at the DRT and the vertical plot, and we became fast friends. And one of the things about serving in a ship, they say that friends may come and go, but shipmates are forever. 1987, I returned to the New Jersey for a visit, and there was Craig Kennedy, having been promoted to commander, and now he was the operations officer. And in my new book is a picture of us standing on the forecastle together.
That's great. So you came on board the ship after its deployment to Vietnam. At that time, and correct me if I'm wrong, the ship was training and gearing up to potentially a second deployment to Vietnam. Obviously, we know that did not end up happening because the ship was then heading to be decommissioned, unfortunately. But what was it like trying to spend time to do the testing, the training, and essentially preparing for a second deployment? And as you said, a lot of the crew already were from the first deployment. And so if you could tell us a little bit about what that was like.
Well, again, calling on a shipmate, there was Lieutenant John Turner, and he took me under his wing to teach me what was going on in CIC and what I needed to know and what I needed to do. And we did indeed do a lot of training. The CIC on the 4th deck is below the armored deck, And right next door, as it were, was one of the main battery plotting rooms. So we coordinated between CIC and main battery plot, and a lot of radio talk, sound-powered phone talk. We went out for shore bombardment practice at San Clemente Island, and that was a full week of activity. I think it went on for 2 or 3 weeks. And I managed to escape CIC in one of the sea details. So I went up topside, and the ship was going into Long Beach on half its power plant, making 27 knots, which was about twice the top speed of the Washoe County with all its engines. And I just marveled at that kind of speed. Then after the training period, stowed my car with Dick Harris's house because we were going on a midshipman cruise. And we had some exercises en route. There was about 15 ships in this midshipman group. And Tom Thornton, my roommate, one of the staterooms was the communication officer. And the ship had an austere reactivation, so only enough communication gear to handle the ship's own traffic. But as the flagship, we were supposed to handle the traffic for, I think there were 15 ships. And Tom did not get much sleep at that time because he was in Radio Central a lot. I remember one night we were steaming in company with some destroyers, and we got calls over the radio. Slow down. We're getting beaten up. The seas are rough. We're getting broken windows. The running lights are getting broken. And I was sitting there serenely in CIC, and I could not feel any motion. It was I was in a room somewhere ashore.
Yeah. Wow.
We continued on. We went to Tacoma, Washington. Well, first to Alameda, California, and that's memorable. This was the home port of a number of aircraft carriers. And the New Jersey, we used to call her TWOAB, the world's only active battleship. So it was really a big deal when we went in for a port visit. So we went into Alameda, and there was a band ashore playing "There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight." And I dare say when people not in the duty section went on liberty, they had a good time. Very hospitable San Francisco people. One of the days I went on liberty, I walked off the ship, and there was a long, long line of people waiting to go aboard, forward, walk down the starboard side, and go ashore from the after brow. And I remember thinking to myself, these people stand in line for a long time just to walk from one end of the ship to the other, and I get to live here every day. Marshall serving in that ship was a thrill, the most enjoyable job I ever had. And we continued on. I'll also add for San Francisco, we had a rear admiral on board as the task force commander, and his official auto was rocked by anti-war protesters when he was in San Francisco. So that was the mood of the country. And ironically, serving near Vietnam, we were shielded from that kind of stuff because we got our news from Armed Forces Radio and from Stars and Stripes newspaper. Well, naturally, they didn't highlight all that. The raucous Democratic Convention in 1968 in Chicago had a lot of violence. I really appreciated that only when I saw newsreels 10 years later on how violent it was. What a terrible time in our country. We felt that we had a duty to perform, and so we kept at it and looked forward to going over and saving Marine Corps lives, Army lives. We went to Tacoma, Washington, and on Liberty I met this cute redhead. We had a couple of dates, and later they had a fantail happy hour or whatever, entertainment. And I was told that somebody dressed up in a red wig to make fun of me and this girl. I happened to be in CIC, so I didn't see it, so I could laugh about it retroactively. But one night I had the duty, and the job was as beach guard, which meant I had a radio link with the ship, and we were keeping track of the comings and goings of visitors because the ship was anchored out, and people had to go out by boat and come back by boat to visit the ship. Well, at one point, this girl in a miniskirt, they were all the rage at that time, along with the anti-war protesters, went out. I think she was with a third-class petty officer. And at 2200, I called back to the ship on the radio and said, "Are all the visitors ashore?" Yes, they are. Sometime later, this same young woman came back in a boat. She was with another sailor, not the one she'd gone to the ship with, and she looked considerably rumpled in the process, so we can only guess what happened there. And then I also had to look after the drunk and disorderly as the crew members came back from Liberty. And there was one particular petty officer who was loud and obnoxious and resistant to getting into the boat. So I asked the shore patrolman there to please help him get in there. Finally, they succeeded. And when he was down in the boat, he pointed up to me and he said, "Hey, you in the Navy suit, if you are lucky, someday you may be lucky to grow up to be a battleship sailor." So you never know what you're going to get, but you take the situation as it comes.
Sure.
Then we went to Hawaii. What a cruise for all these midshipmen, and we got to enjoy it as well. Again, luck happens. I had been dating a young woman going to school in the Long Beach area, and lo and behold, she was going to summer school at the University of Hawaii. And so I had ready-made dates. We toured the island. We went to a Tommy Sands floor show, I don't know what all else. And Marshall, it was kind of a blessing to have the duty every fourth day just so I could rest up. On July 20th of 1969, several of us were in the lounge adjacent to the wardrobe on the main deck. The television was there, and it showed Neil Armstrong's space capsule landing on the moon. The first landing.
You watched that from the officer's lounge?
Yes.
Wow.
And then went to Waikiki Beach for the afternoon, and I was watching the lifeguards TV when the Neil Armstrong came out of the capsule and said, "This is a small step for man, a giant leap for mankind." I thought, it's burned in my memory where I was when that happened. So we were, I think, 10 days there in Hawaii and then headed back to San Diego. And I was detached briefly to go to Officer of the Deck School. I'd been an Officer of the Deck in the Washoe County, and I thought, wouldn't it be neat to drive this huge, majestic ship? As it turned out, though, that the officers of the deck were drawn from the weapons department, but I would have been well trained had the opportunity come up. You mentioned.
So let me ask you, you mentioned earlier, so obviously we know that CIC is down on fourth deck. And talking in the previous question about some of the training and exercises that you were doing, did you actually ever see 16-inch guns fire in person, or were you below deck that entire time?
Well, the answer is yes and no. I saw the guns fire when I visited the ship in 1983.
Okay.
I was below decks the entire time on 1969.
Wow. Okay. So you finally got your chance in 83. Well, that's good.
Yes.
Okay.
So then after OD school, I came back that was in San Diego. I came back to Long Beach, and I was in the operations office, maybe 1100 one morning in late August, and Captain Snyder came on the 1MC. And I have to say that Captain Snyder was the best commanding officer I ever served with, and that includes a lot of fine people.
We hear that a lot. We get a lot of that same sentiment here from the Vietnam.
He had a touch. He cared about the people, and it showed. He entrusted the officers of the deck to handle things on the bridge. He didn't need to be there all the time. He would go through crew's mess, go in the bakery and sample something that was being cooked every month, or maybe every month he had a birthday cake for all the sailors whose birthdays were that month. And he told me later that he got awfully tired of eating cake, but it was part of building the morale. And there's a statement that is so true. Loyalty down begets loyalty upward. And I remember just passing by a seaman one time, and Captain Snyder was in the vicinity, and referring to him, the seaman said, "He's a cool head." And that told me that the captain was doing exactly what he needed to do.
I wanted to ask you, shortly thereafter, all the crew learned the news that the ship was heading towards being decommissioned. What was the reaction? What was the mood of the crew at the time, and the feeling on ultimately, instead of ending up on a second deployment to Vietnam, that the ship was going back to be to be mothballed and decommissioned?
Well, I think it was about 1100 one morning. I was in the operations office, and Captain Snyder came on the 1MC and passed on the bad news that it was being announced in Washington that the New Jersey would be mothballed and decommissioned rather than going on a second Vietnam deployment. And essentially, this is what I had signed up for, and now it was coming to an early end.
Yeah.
To answer your question, the mood throughout the ship was gloom and doom. We were just so primed to go over there and do the job, and now nothing. Captain Peniston had come on board and take over from Captain Snyder, regular relief. And so he heard the news at about the same time. And Captain Peniston had a special relationship with the New Jersey. In 1943, when he was a plebe at the Naval Academy, they had sent boats out to visit ships that were anchored in Annapolis Roads, and one of the ships was the New Jersey, and that was the first Navy ship he had ever gone aboard.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Plebe. When he was commissioned in 1946, his first ship as an ensign was the New Jersey. And the ship was in the doldrums by then. They just for something to do, they would set up an after brow and then still another one on of which the garbage was emptied from the ship. So they had officers to man these brows. Well, Captain Peniston had finally gotten orders to what he called the big ship in my life. And he and the rest of us were just crestfallen. Probably he more than anybody else. Captain Snyder already had his orders and was going to other duty. So the time came, about within a few days of when we would have departed for Vietnam, we got underway for Bremerton, Washington, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. And so that was only 3 days that Captain Peniston got to run the ship at sea. And he had a different personality from Captain Snyder. He was very much a traditionalist, by-the-book person, whereas Captain Snyder would roam the ship. Captain Peniston stayed on the bridge in his captain's chair and in the captain's sea cabin. So it took us 3 days to get there. We went through Puget Sound. And again, I'm hearing about this in CIC from the people up topside. Look at those beautiful green trees and all. We pulled into a pier and we were across the pier from 3 World War II warships that had seen their better days long before. Apparently, speaking of target practice, seagulls had used these ships for target practice, and unfortunately that later became a role for the New Jersey. So the job for the next 3 months until mid-December was to inactivate things. Well, if there's an individual that probably doesn't have a whole lot of role in decommissioning a ship, it's the assistant CIC officer, because that's a job that you do at sea. So I was released from active duty in the 15th of October. So I was in the crew for just short of 5 months. And I went home to Missouri and enrolled to start journalism school in the spring semester. But I had such a connection with the ship that I came back out to Bremerton for the decommissioning ceremony on the 17th of December. And the weather was overcast. It was so gloomy, it fit the mood of the day. Commander Jim Elfelt was the executive officer. He's one of the finest human beings I have ever met. He always put yourself at your own level when he talked. He didn't condescend at all. The executive officer is supposed to be the bad guy in the good cop, bad cop routine. Well, in the New Jersey, there were 2 good cops. He arranged this ceremony. So I sat in the audience in civilian clothes next to a guy who was much older and obviously a veteran sea dog. And we watched and listened. Governor Daniel Evans of the new state of Washington spoke. Captain Peniston spoke. And his words have taken on an immortal flavor.
Yes.
Rest well, New Jersey, that hear the call, if again sounded, provide firepower for freedom. And thanks to her magnificent crew, she will be ready. And that prophecy came true in the 1980s because she had been so well preserved and put away. But then I had another piece of luck. Turned out that getting on board the ship was luck and getting off the ship was luck. because 2 weeks after the decommissioning, I went 600 miles for a blind date in Minneapolis, Minnesota. From Missouri, that's 600.
Wow.
A couple lived there, and because there was a garbage strike in Minneapolis that fall, they got to know their neighbor, who was a librarian at the University of Minnesota Library. So a friend I'd known both in college and in the Navy began giving her rides to work. So he and his wife sent me a letter, a picture of her, and said, "You're going into journalism. She runs the journalism library. Maybe you should come meet her." So I did. We met on December 30th, 1969, one day before the end of the 60s. We were engaged by April and got married in August. I have a feeling I never would have met Karen if not for the ship being mothballed. So you never know.
Funny how things turn out at the end of the day, right?
Operating engineers are the men and women that move mountains. And the Engineers Labor Employer Cooperative, ELEC, puts them to work. They create opportunities for the men, women, and union signatory contractors of Local 825. Repaving our roads, keeping our homes bright and warm, and even building our favorite team stadium. We understand infrastructure. That's why ELEC and Local 825 are ready to get to work.
I've heard in a previous interview you said that the New Jersey sort of changed your perspective that you had on serving in the Navy. Can you tell us a little bit about why that was the case and that shift for you when you served on board here?
Well, it seemed a lot of times in the Washoe County we were scrambling. There was not nearly the level of talent and skill on board an LST. Just doing these cargo runs could get pretty boring. But here I came to the New Jersey and it was vibrant. It was alive. You're filled with professionals. Things had been planned, prepared for, were carried out according to the preparations. And the bond in the wardroom and with others was just amazing. Got to know the men in my division, other divisions. And interestingly, we sat for evening meal at the same relative positions in the long wardroom tables that run athwart ships. And each of the officers had a silver napkin ring. And mine said Assistant CIC Officer on it. So one of the jobs for the stewards before the evening meal was to lay out these napkin rings in order of seniority, rank, date of rank, and what have you. Well, nobody's getting promoted very often, so we sat and conferred with the same people night after night, and that built a bond. So that kind of camaraderie, I look back so nostalgically, just having had that opportunity, even though we didn't have the fulfillment of a second deployment, but especially looking back, that shipmates are indeed forever. I go to reunions and the memories just flow forth. It's as if time has not passed. You remember this? You remember that? Well, sure, I recall that.
You then spent 30 years working at the U.S. Naval Institute. Over the course of those 30 years, you had several different jobs, including as editor at the Proceedings magazine and being the point person on the oral history interviews at the Institute. You obviously wrote your 1986 book, Battleship New Jersey. And we're here to also talk about your new edition of the book, Battleship New Jersey, The Complete History, which is being published on August 5th. And this awesome looking dust jacket, which I love. This is one of my favorite pictures of the ship. And can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write a book about the battleship and life at the Naval Institute?
Well, again, I have to backtrack a little, Marshall. When I went to journalism school, I was convinced, I had known since high school journalism class, that I was going to be a sports writer. So I took the journalism course, primarily concentrating on newspapers rather than broadcast. But I needed a thesis for my master's topic, and I persuaded the advisor that I could write a thesis about the interaction between the news media and Navy public affairs during the New Jersey's Vietnam service. So in the process of writing that, I interviewed a bunch of news media people and a number of crew members, including both Captain Snyder, Captain Peniston, and I needed a naval officer as part of the committee that would interrogate me for the oral exam to pass the master's degree. Again, luck, I keep talking about luck, but I was at home one day reading the Naval Institute proceedings in 1972, and it said, Captain Paul Schratz, a submarine veteran, is teaching at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. By this time, I had gone into sports journalism with no luck. I was assistant PR man for the St. Louis baseball Cardinals. That ended after about 5 months because the players struck, and Anheuser-Busch said, well, we have to show that this strike hurt the ball club too. So we're getting rid of our $7,000 a year assistant PR man. I didn't stay there long enough to earn the $7,000. Then I went across the hall at Busch Stadium and was assistant PR man for the football Cardinals. Put together the game programs and monitored the press box during games. So after 2 seasons, I went to the owner and said, I've had increased responsibilities. This second year, I've learned a lot. How about a raise? He said, well, we do raises just once a year. That's in February. So on the 3rd of January, he fired me because he could save the salary during the off season. So that's when I began to think this sports thing is not working out. So I got in touch with Captain Schratz, the man whom I'd met at the university. He had subsequently moved to Annapolis. Aaron and I had visited it on a second honeymoon, really liked the area. So I sent him a bunch of resumes and asked him to pass them around. And one of them landed at the Naval Institute when there was an opening for an assistant editor on proceedings. And I never dreamed that I would become a naval historian, but it just happened because we'd get historical articles. And then I had the first book I did was on the 40th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And usually you have to have an agent to get a publishing contract. Well, in this case, I'd been working there for several years, and so the people in the book department knew me and gave go-ahead to the proposal. And I also got to do oral history when the man in charge of that retired. And you talk about a really enjoyable job. Not quite up to serving in New Jersey, but very close. Involved with interviewing people who had made naval history, from seamen to admirals, chiefs of naval operations, the first skipper of the USS Nautilus, the first black 4-star admiral, the first black naval officers, period. And I used the interviewing technique for a lot of the research for the New Jersey book, which was the one that came after Pearl Harbor. I wanted to pay tribute to the ship because it had continued to mean so much to me. So I would call up, I had a roster of former crew members, and I would call them up. And as soon as I told them I'd served in the ship, we had instant rapport. It was as if we had dated the same girl and we were comparing notes. So I got a contract to do a book on New Jersey. And in 1983, soon after she was recommissioned, I went aboard for a couple of weeks to find out about the modernized ship. I interviewed Captain Fogarty, who was a marvelous host. He had an additional role, not only of commanding the first recommissioned ship, but selling the idea of recommissioning the other 3 of the Iowa class. And that did indeed happen. So, and then I would wander around the ship, talk to people, and just get a sense of how the ship was different and how it was the same as I had known it. And yes, I escaped from CIC. I went up to the 013 level with a camera, and when the 16-inch guns went off, the word awesome is often overused, but it truly fit in that case. The sensation of the noise, the heat, the light, it just engulfs you, the pressure. I never did see a 9-gun salvo, but even fewer than that make a definite impression. So that was kind of a bonus of working on the bit, and interviewed any number of crew members because there have been books about the technical aspects of the Iowa class. I wanted to convey the experience I had had and that my shipmates had had. What is it like to live and serve in this wonderful ship on a day-to-day basis? And the memories were warm, and they sometimes went on and on because they had so much enthusiasm to tell me about it. So then it was a matter of taking these various sources, plus going to the National Archives, looking through the ship's deck logs just to verify things, World War II action reports. At that point in the 90s was only 40 years past World War II, so a number of the original crew members were still on board. I mentioned that I had interviewed early black naval officers. In 1983, interviewed Dr. Lewis Ivey, who was the first black officer to serve in the ship. And he told me he came aboard one night. He was shown to a stateroom, and the other man in the stateroom disappeared in the night because he didn't want a room with a black man. But Ivey was such a competent person that he later became part of the traveling medical team that went with President Carter on various trips. Ivey told me about being on Liberty in Europe, going to France, midshipman cruise. And he said race was not an issue there. And so he could hang around with his white shipmates and be treated as an equal. Well, 40 years later, in 1983, the ship put on a 40th anniversary program of the original commissioning in 1943. And I was honored by a friend named Walt Urban, who got together a crew member for each decade the ship had been in active service. So there was a World War II veteran. Dr. Ivey spoke on behalf of the 90s crew members, and I just had a joyous reunion with him. And Vice Admiral Doug Katz, who commanded the ship in the 80s, represented that decade. And then there was a supply officer for the brief time in the 90s, had attended the decommissioning of New Jersey in 1981 at Long Beach. And that was a giant reunion for former crew members. One of the men I encountered on the deck was Bosun Joe Heaney. Well, when I was in the crew, he was a salty, seasoned warrant officer in charge of the bosun's mates. They don't come much tougher. So I had a feeling of apprehension that somebody like Joe Heaney probably eats lieutenants for breakfast. Well, we happened to run into each other at the decommissioning, and he was so warm and friendly that we kept in touch with each other the rest of his life. And it was just chance meetings like that mean so much. I got to know Captain Tucker, later Rear Admiral. He carried on in the fine tradition that Doug Katz had engendered in the ship. He had the idea that we are going out in style, and the decommissioning ceremony was done with class, with dignity. He directed that the flag, the national ensign, come down for the last time, that the commissioning pennant come down, ended the last deck watch. And I had met Marvin Williams, who was the
Pope Willie,
senior enlisted man. Yes, he had put out some rules in the chief's mess, and he said, remember, only God loves you more than I do. So some of the other chiefs put together a plaque that said Pope Willie the First. But I had a good visit with him. He was the last enlisted man to come off the ship, and Captain Tucker was the last officer, and each went down the line shaking hands with former shipmates and looking forwards to times when our paths would cross again.
Well, I'm happy to say that that ensign that flew over the ship for the last time was just recently returned back to us, thanks to Admiral Tucker. And of course, the commissioning pennant that was hauled down when the ship was decommissioned for the final time, then was used to commission our new sister ship, the USS New Jersey SSN 796 submarine late last year. A great continuing of our legacy. I wanted to ask you what you wrote the original book about New Jersey in 1986. It's now 2025. What led you to embark on writing a new edition of the book to cover some of our later history? Now, I talked to Ryan Szymanski, our curator. He says he bullied you a little bit into writing it. So I wanted to ask what led you ultimately to decide to write a new edition of the book?
Well, I don't want to take any wind out of Ryan's sails because he is a formidable expert on this ship. But I began the research for the updated edition in 1990.
Okay.
In 1986, the first edition came out, and my dad said, this is like trying to paint a picture of a moving train, because every day more history was being made. Well, you have to have a cutoff at some point. So it was published in 1986, and then the ship was decommissioned. And I made a visit to the ship in 1980 and interviewed about a dozen crew members, including Captain Tucker. And I talked to a first-class gunner's mate, Leon Tucker, who later became the vice president of the New Jersey Reunion Group. And so that I had visited the ship in the early 80s. At the beginning of the 90s, I gathered still more information. I talked to Chaplain Jim Nichols, and at the decommissioning ceremony on February 8th, 1991, Chaplain Nichols said the benediction, and then he and Leon Tucker were off to the Persian Gulf to report to the Missouri, which was then involved in the Gulf War. How ironic that the New Jersey would be decommissioned in the midst of another war.
Yeah, sadly.
Well, I went aboard the Missouri and I saw Leon Tucker. So did another interview.
Old home week.
Yes, and that interview went in my book on the history of the Missouri. And the same friend, John Charles Roach, did the cover painting for both the Missouri and New Jersey books.
I wanted to ask you one other thing. I mentioned earlier in your introduction, you've written 14 books, but you also wrote a book, Battleship Commander, about Admiral Willis Lee, a notable commander, a notable admiral who maybe flies a little bit under the radar when you talk about some of the bigger names like Halsey and Spruance and some of the other folks associated with the ship. What made you decide to write a book about Willis Lee?
Again, a matter of luck. One day I was in the operations office in the New Jersey, and I was paging through World War II cruise book. And there on one page were pictures of the 4 flag officers who had been embarked during the war. They were Admiral Halsey, Admiral Spruance, Oscar Badger, and Willis Lee. And Willis Lee did not seek glory in any way. He just wanted to do his job and do it well. He was an amazingly smart man. He understood the value of radar before many of his contemporaries and demonstrated that in the Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942. His flagship, Washington, sank the Japanese Hiroshima, and he wrote a modest report and said in the after action, he said, really, the only difference was that we had radar and she didn't. And he claimed that the Washington had scored 8 hits on Hiroshima. It turned out later research has put the number as high as 20. He died just 2 weeks, not even 2 weeks after the end of the war. I interviewed his flag lieutenant, a man named Gil Ertzen, who joined him in 1942. Lee and his wife had no children. Ertzen was like a surrogate son. They stayed together through the remainder of the war. In the summer of 1945, Lee was called back to Casco Bay, Maine, to work on tactics for dealing with the kamikazes. And Ertzen went with him. The Ertzen and his wife and the Lee and his wife lived in the same house ashore. And the junior officer and senior officer, they were just friends and good companions. And Lee and his wife took the upstairs bedroom. He said, you and your wife could take the one downstairs. And so we'll just make do up here. And I talked to Mary Ertzen, his wife, and she said, sometimes at night I could hear footsteps above. Admiral Lee was pacing. So they had a heart-to-heart talk. And she said he felt so deflated because he had wanted to be out there with his battleships to finish the war that he had started so ably. In fact, his wife wrote a letter back to her sisters in Illinois and said, Lee misses his battleships. You'd think they were his toys and he wants to play with them. But he never got to see him again.
Sadly.
And the day that the Ertzens were due to detach from active duty, go back to reserve life, they say the Lees made breakfast for him very carefully, and they said their goodbyes, and Lee got into a motor launch, an admiral's barge, to take him out to his office on Great Diamond Island, and he had a fatal heart attack. And one might surmise that the psychological letdown in addition to his physical condition, he didn't see a future ahead. That's speculation, of course, but that's the way his life ended. And so there was no memoir, not that he would have written one anyway. So I thought this is a fascinating person. And I interviewed a lot of people who had served with him, went through the action reports, the deck logs. And I keep saying luck, but again, I was lucky. There had been a man in his hometown in Owenton, Kentucky, who had been researching a biography of Lee. He was a newspaper man. Didn't have a background in naval history, but he was a capable writer. But he died before he could get anything published. He had written away to a lot of Lee's contemporaries, including Naval Academy classmates, shipmates, and what have you. Well, the last known address I had for Evan Smith was in Cincinnati. So I found his name in a Cincinnati phone book, which is a commodity we used to have at that time. And it went to his widow, who was living in Versailles, Kentucky. She invited me to come to her home and take home all the material that her husband had gathered, including these letters from shipmates and classmates. There would have been no way I could otherwise have gotten that material. There were no strings attached. She said, I was wondering what to do with this material, and then I got your letter, and you will finish the job. Unfortunately, it took too many years to get it done. Felt so much satisfaction that it finally came out in 2021. This is after starting the research in 1975. And people ask the obvious question, Paul, what took you so long? Well, 12 other books intervened. And my son overheard that and said, gee, I just hate it when that happens. But I feel so much satisfaction because I don't think anybody else would have written the story of Willis Lee.
Yeah. Well, we're doing our part here on the battleship to try to honor some of the great admirals who served aboard, Halsey, Spruance. We've come up with the Admiral's little coin series. I'm going to send you one of these in the mail. So we've got one for Willis Lee as well, with the World War II crest on the back of it. And we've got one for Halsey, Spruance, Lee, Jocko Clark from Korea, 7th Fleet, and of course our friend Paul Reason from Battle Group Romeo. We're going to send you one of these so you've got one to go along with your book. But I wanted to ask you, and I just did this with Ryan, and I wanted to ask you a few sort of what I'm calling quick fire questions. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I just want you to tell me the first thing that comes to your head, okay?
All right.
Your all-time favorite class of Navy ship.
Iowa class battleships.
Your favorite BB-62 captain.
Snyder.
Your favorite BB-62 flagship admiral. I think maybe I know the answer to that already.
Well, of course, Willis Lee.
Your favorite ship of all time, excluding the Battleship New Jersey.
That is a toughie. I would have to go with Missouri because I came from the state of Missouri. I was able to ride the ship on her last visit to Pearl Harbor in 1991. She went there to commemorate the 50th anniversary. And to be on board for that final voyage was just so emotional. Came around the southern edge of Oahu. You could just see the sun coming up over Diamond Head in the background. We turned into the entrance channel to Pearl Harbor, and in my mind's eye, I could see the battleships in the newsreels from 1941 pouring out smoke, see the quays where they had been moored. And finally, we came abreast of Arizona Memorial just as the first boatloads of tourists were going ashore. And that was such a supreme emotional moment. And for researching the book, I interviewed President Truman's daughter, Margaret, because she had been the sponsor. And her favorite memory of the christening, well, maybe not her favorite, when I broke that bottle of champagne, it spilled all over my coat and I couldn't get the smell out for years.
I wanted to ask you one last and final question. This is the WETSU podcast. We eat this stuff up, the motto of our friend, Rear Admiral Ron Tucker. And I ask this of everybody. Do you have any great WETSU type of moments from either your time here on the New Jersey or your general time in your 30 years in the Navy or at the Naval Institute that sort of stand out to you?
Well, I would just have to say that the 5 months I spent on board, I was eating it up every day. I could not have asked for a better place to be during that time in my life.
I just wanted to acknowledge one other thing. When I was reading through some of the new parts of the book, and of course, opening up and reading the beginning and reading the acknowledgments, first of all, very surprised to see my name in there. So one, that thank you. But your acknowledgement of our crew, of Ryan and Libby, and of course, my predecessors here in the executive director role, it brought a smile to my face because of some of the things that you wrote in the New Forward really were sort of ingrained in me that, our museum crew, I'm not a veteran. People like Ryan and Libby are not veterans, but we do this because we love it. We do it because we love this amazing ship. And we're patriots and we love the Navy. And it really resonated with me. So I wanted to thank you also for, those acknowledgments of what we're doing here and the appreciation for you on behalf of all of us for writing this history of our great ship and really being the definitive history and the most in-depth history that we have of the ship all put together in one place. So I wanted to thank you, Paul, and I want to extend our thanks to you for sharing these firsthand accounts, for sharing these firsthand experiences, remarkable insights, and of course, your unwavering dedication to preserving the living history of our nation's most decorated battleship. So, Paul Stillwell, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for joining us on WETSU, and we look forward to seeing you back on board very soon.
I look forward to that also. Thank you, Marshall.
Thank you, Paul. Paul's book, as I mentioned, Battleship New Jersey, The Complete History, comes out August 5th. This is the great book. You can get it for yourself at home on Amazon, through the Naval Institute Press, and it will also be available right here at the Battleship New Jersey, in person at our ship store, and online on our battle shop. Thank you for listening to WETSU, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Operating engineers are the men and women that move mountains. And the Engineers Labor Employer Cooperative, ELEC, puts them to work. They create opportunities for the men, women, and union signatory contractors of Local 825. Repaving our roads, keeping our homes bright and warm, and even building our favorite team stadium. We understand infrastructure. That's why ELEC and Local 825 are ready to get to work.